Hello everyone, this is Bradley. Today this is a fundamental tutorial talking about the loop node. I want to remind you that the loop node is something that has been discussed a long time ago. In fact, I think it's one of the first fundamental tutorials that I've ever made. And that tutorial isn't actually outdated. Although surprisingly people still ask for a new one. I'm actually not quite happy with this, but today I'm still going to discuss the same concepts with a different method. So let's start. So here we only have a default cube with a blue emission materials. And I have a very simple node which is called object material output node. Its function is basically just to assign a material to the object. For example, if I have a cube, select the cube, so instantaneously I lost all the materials assigned to that because I didn't put any materials yet. But I can change the blue, I can change the red, I can change the white, I can change the yellow. This function is very straightforward. Just assign material to the object that you selected. Okay. And here's another part of the node tree that's basically to instance the objects on a grid. So let's just select our cubes and copy for object and deep copy. So now I have 9 objects being assigned on 9 locations of the grid. And if I change the blue material, so what I would like to do is I want to use this object material output node to assign the material to all these objects, because if I have to do this one by one, it does work, but it's kind of painful that I have to do that 9 times. And assuming if I have 100 objects, then obviously I'm not going to do that by hand. Okay, so using node definitely will be much easier in such a kind of case. However, so let's try. So let's first return this yellow material into the blue so that we can see the effects readily. And let's just put this object into the object socket. And you see, it doesn't actually work. And it appears with a get list elements node. This is actually a very tricky thing because in the past, when such kind of thing occurs, you just won't get any linkage. But now you do get a linkage plus a get list elements node. So it seems like you do get something, but in fact you didn't get anything. I will explain later about what it means. So first, let's take a look with the output of this object matrix output. So if I select the node NW, go to the viewer, what you can see, I output 9 objects, cube 001, cube 002, cube 003, and so on and so forth. In total, 9 objects. I don't think I really need to explain what does it mean by get list element, but just to take a look with its output as well. So this node only outputs a cube 001 because it selected the index number 0 object from the list, and the index 0 is cube 001. And the question is why it happens. The reason is that this object material output node does not receive multiple inputs. It can only receive a single input. So in order to make the linkage more meaningful, the current version of animation node automatically gives you a get list element node. So it forms a kind of meaningful linkage while it doesn't actually function in the way that you want. So the question is, what if I would like to convert all these objects into the blue material using the nodes? One way that you can potentially do is just to shift the duplicate the nodes, put the objects into the list, and change the index number to 1, and shift the duplicate the node, put the objects into the list, plus 1 index number, and shift the duplicate the node, and put the objects into the list, and plus a index number, and shift the duplicate. I'm not going to do that further. You realize the problem, it lost the meaning of using nodes. The reason we use animation nodes all the time is because it makes your life much easier to do a lot of work that requires manual working. But now it does not make my life anywhere easier, and it generates more spaghettis. In such kind of cases, I may rather just change everything by hand. Although change anything by hand is not actually suggestible in such a case. But this is kind of issue that you will encounter in such kind of circumstances. So here's the way to really solve that, and the reason is just the method is just to use a loop. So if I select this node, hit W, and you can see there's a loop through objects. So let's just have this button, the loop through objects. And what it happens, you can see within this loop input node, it actually input an object instead of a object. So it's not a plural form. And in this case, you can actually put the object into that. So now you change everything, the material of everything. And you can take a red, you can take a white, you can take a yellow. Very straightforward. Instead of duplicating, change the index number, change the index number. Very, very simple and straightforward. So let's summarize that what have we just learned is that in essence, I don't think I need to go to the dictionary and tell you what the loop means. But in essence, the loop is just to help you to do a function repeatedly, as what you saw earlier, that I have to duplicate the get list elements and object material output, duplicate, and so on and so forth. But at this moment, I only need basically 3 nodes in total to do all the function very easily. And it's completely procedural. But more importantly, if you ask me when to actually use a loop, it's because, or why do I actually use a loop, is because the object material output node does not receive multiple inputs. It will give you a very meaningless workaround to get list elements, but as you see earlier, it does not make sense at all. It does not give you a desired effect. Okay. And there are many other nodes which is similar to object material output. For example, object mesh data. If you put the plural into the socket, it does not work. And there is other node which is called set vertex color. If you put the plural into the socket and it still does not actually work, it means you still have to get a loop for all these nodes. And you never know when this node can potentially receive multiple outputs. By the way, if you ever wish to ask the question that is there actually a node that does not actually loop and need a loop, and you really have an example here, which is the object matrix output. So if you just take a look with the default object matrix output, you can see it has a socket which is 100% the same as the object material output, the object mesh data, and the set vertex color. But the difference is if you put the plural objects into the socket, it will turn everything into objects. Okay. However, if you put the plurals into the object material output, it will give you a meaningless node. So this is really the difference. So besides the definition of all this kind of loop and whatever things in the dictionary, 90% of the time, the reason I'm using a loop is because the socket does not receive multiple inputs. So that in order not to do a repetitive action by hand, I'm using a loop. And another thing I just want to remind you, because one kind of statement that I don't really like is people asking me, I would like to do such kind of effects. Do I actually need a loop? This kind of statement is very, very weird, because in this kind of simple setup, even if you do not see any loop, I do not use any loop, but the loop is still there. You just don't see it. The loop is still encoded into the program. So even if I'm not a programmer, but it does make sense about how this node is looping itself. Because I have 9 objects and I have 9 locations. I need to make sure each of the objects goes to a different location instead of 9 objects goes to a single location. And then I need to require a loop and so on and so forth. So even if you do not see a loop, you are actually using that. You're just not seeing that, and you're maybe not aware of that, and so on. But it's there. The loop is essentially everywhere. So let's finally take a look with the loop inputs, and let's turn off the viewer. So if we directly, so there are two ways that you call a loop. You just hit the node and hit W, goes to the right, as we have I have shown you earlier. There's another way, just call a loop input. And looking with a default loop input, you do see several values: the index, iteration, iterator, parameter, and the output. Basically, there are 5 options you have, but one option does not have any sockets left. The index number is just the index. Do I actually need to go to the dictionary to tell you what the index is? I'm not even a native speaker. I suppose you probably know more than I do. No. So if I select the socket and goes to the viewer, you can see there is an index for each object. But one very weird thing for computer to do is that I have cube 001, cube 002, but the index always starts from 0. This rule also applies for the index. So this loop will be run several times, and I have a first loop for the first object whose index is 0. I have the second loop whose index is 1. I have the third loop whose index is 2. I have the fourth loop whose index is 3, and so on and so forth until the end. Iteration means how many times this loop will be run. So if you invoke a subprogram of so you hit W, goes to right, you invoke a subprogram of a loop that does not have an iterator, then it will just give you an option of iteration. And obviously, if your iteration is 0, then it means your loop won't be run at all. It's not functional. If your iterator is 1, then it means this loop will be run for 1 times, iteration for 2, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, straightforward. But just to get an idea about how index will change over time as iteration goes. And here's a very important difference between the index and the iteration. The iteration is a solid number. So if you know that your loop will run 4 times, the iteration will always be 4. But the index number is different because it will change as the loop goes. It will tell you whether this is the first loop, the second loop, the third loop, the fourth loop, while the iteration is a solid number. So this is one of the difference. The iterator is something that will also change. For example, if you put you put an object list into the iterator. So for example, I generate an object list into the iterator. Then it means I will run the first element in the list, the second element in the list, the third element in the list, the fourth element in the list. And this is why the loop actually helps for this object material output to function well for multiple inputs, because you input a object list. So let's go with the invoke subprogram. Because you input an object list, so you input a plural into plural. But within the loop itself, because each time you just select one element, you just get one list element from the list. So that's why you can input a single element to a node that can only receive a single element. And this is how iterator works. And because you have the iterator, it will just function in a way that replaces the iteration. So if you invoke a subprogram, you no longer see the iterations, but you only see an object list. Another thing to remind you is that because if you're using the loop, it always assume that you potentially need to run this loop for several times. So the iterator never have an option to make a single object. It will always either use the object list or object list or object list. This rule also applies to many other things like material list, matrix list, and so on and so forth. It's really all about it. The parameter is a value that won't change across the loop. So let's just hit this plus icon and type in object. You can see you can choose object or object list. If you choose an object list, then it means you can receive multiple inputs. But if you choose an object, it will occur as the same thing as all this kind of set vertex color and object to material output. So it's something that you can potentially try. So let's hit this parameter, and let's hit the objects into the parameter. You can see there is a single socket. And if you put the plural into the sockets, and it will give you a get list element, and this is completely useless. And this is why there are many nodes that actually does not work in the way easily as the object matrix output, because the coding theory is something like just you put a material, you put a single value socket into the parameter instead of iterator, something like that, so on and so forth. I'm not a coder, so please don't ask me too detailed questions. The importance of the parameter, I think it's I don't want to go to the dictionary to tell you what parameter means. But let's just give you kind of an example. If I have a material, if I have a material, and I put this material into the material socket, it will form a linkage, of course. And if we go to the render view again, and you can have 9 objects, of course, and now I don't have any materials on them at all. I can decide whether I actually goes as a loop material. So if I assign a loop red material, then a single red material will be applied to all of them. But if I choose to a yellow material, then the yellow material will apply to all of them. If I choose to a white material, then white material will be applied to all of them. So the parameter is not something that will change as the time goes. And there are some circumstances that you potentially would like to input multiple value into a socket. For example, multiple materials for a single object. Then let's just give an example that I have a create material list, and I set a blue and yellow, and I wish to put this list into this material, and it does not actually work because this is a material socket while I'm actually inputting a list socket. So it will do the same thing as the get list element, which is completely useless. In such a case, you just hit this plus icon and hit material list, and let's use the material list into the socket. Just be aware, different from this object socket, the material socket, however, can convert itself into the plural form, so that it can actually receive multiple materials. If I put this socket in this material list, then even though you do not see anything meaningful, but you do see all this object actually contains 2 materials. So you can potentially set these yellow materials into red materials, and you can see how everything has been changed. And you can change this blue material into the yellow material, and so on and so forth. This is just an example about how it works. There are lots of things that they can potentially work around with that, but the basics idea is really all about it. The outputs is something, if you want to output these objects from the loop, so you have to pass the, you have to hit this plus icon to output an object list, put an object into the socket, and you would output a list. So it seems like you are outputting a single object, but because this loop will be run several times, so the output will accumulate, finally form a list back. So you input a list, output a list, but while you're in the loop, everything for the iterator will be a single element, a single list element from the output, or from the input, so on and so forth. Actually, it's much straightforward. It's really simple. Last example I would like to mention before I close up for this tutorial is if I would like to assign the object with an alternating pattern like the yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, whatever stuff, then how should I actually do with such kind of thing? There are essentially multiple ways, but the easiest way I would say just to put everything into the iterator. So let's just take a material list in the iterator, put the material in the socket, and basically this is halfway done. The reason I'm doing this is because within a loop, the object socket will take one list element from the object list. The material socket will take a single element from the material list. So that's basically it means each object will only receive a single material respectively. And because we're inputting a yellow-red material, so it will form an alternating patterns. Like the first object will receive yellow, the second object will receive red. So here, let's just give you a try. If I put this list into material list, you can see only two objects has been assigned to an alternating color. This is because the iteration of the loop will be limited to the lowest number of the iterator. And you can see the iteration is 2. So here, in order for all the object has a material, I have to repeat this list so that increase that beyond 2. So you can just readily type in the repeat list. And here's a kind of interesting thing. So if you directly put in, it already works. You have the yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, red alternating patterns. It's possible that you just change the amount into length, and you put the guessed length into length, or doing whatever kind of things. So that you're inputting 9 objects and 9 materials. But sometimes you may just not care. You just repeat as much amount of materials as possible, because since the iteration of the loop will be limited to the lowest number of iterator, so even if I'm outputting 10 elements or even more elements, like 28 elements, I'm finally still outputting only 9 objects. And each object still have its own single materials. So something like that. It's actually very easy, straightforward. I don't want to discuss more with the loop basics because it's actually really straightforward. There's nothing essentially hard. So again, 90% of the time the reason you use a loop is because the node does not receive multiple inputs. Officially speaking, such kind of issue is called vectorization. A node is vectorized, meaning that the node can receive multiple inputs. But if the node cannot receive multiple inputs, it means the node is not vectorized. But essentially, this is all about it. So when will this mesh object input node be vectorized? You have to ask the developer. And when this set vertex color node will be vectorized, you have to ask the developer. I'm not a programmer, so I don't actually know how coding is difficult for all this node to be vectorized. But I suppose there is a reason why there is they haven't been vectorized or whatever stuff. But just to say that many times I don't actually even know which node has been vectorized and which node has not been vectorized. And sometimes you just have to try by yourself. And very interestingly, there is some node which is like object matrix inputs. So we do see the vectorization of object matrix outputs. But if you put the plural into the socket, you do see it actually does not really work. So I think it's more kind of a mistake from the developer side, but I don't know, whatever, who cares. But when such kind of thing occurs, it means you just have to use a loop. So select the node, hit W goes to right. Loop, loop, loop throughout. That's also, so since I mentioned that 90% of the time the reason to use a loop is because the node has not been vectorized, then what's the rest of 10% of the time? So let's think about the loop. The loop, you can put a lot of nodes within the loop. It also means you can actually create a lot of presets. So I do have a lot of presets. For example, a preset that I've mentioned a billion times is about vertex transition loop and the vertex transition list. You can see there is two sets of the presets. I don't want to discuss the functionality of this node. It has been discussed in my motion graphics or whatever stuff. But just to say, in reality, this node actually contains about 6 or 7 nodes within between. And because I saved the entire node trees into the startup files, so I can readily search and readily search the vertex transition loop, so that it forms a preset for the function, instead of use every time that I'm have to put a lot of set vertex color in between and combine color and object mesh data. So it saves a lot of time if you're making presets. All this kind of things has been discussed in the presets basics tutorial that I don't want to mention. It also includes the reason why you need a loop and a list. Also, one more thing to discuss essentially is that sometimes it raises a lot of hatred to the fact that many nodes hasn't been vectorized. So that it's even possible to make some very stupid preset ever. For example, object mesh data list that finally generates. Basically, within this loop node, it's just a simple object mesh data node. It's really all about it. But it makes your life much more convenient instead of just select the node, hitting W goes to right, and so on and so forth. So it's really all about it. There's probably more I can say, but I will just stop here. The loop node is not really something I was discovered. Just to say that loop node sounds to be a very weird thing, or very strange thing that exists in animation nodes, but it doesn't make sense a lot, and it's not something that you need to really worry about in terms of animation nodes. It's probably one of the simplest things that you can ever imagine in animation nodes because it makes sense so well. So basically that's it. I think that's it. So don't be afraid of the loop. That's what I would like to discuss. And again, I hate the statement that, oh, if I would like to do this kind of effect, that doesn't mean I need a loop. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.